He slammed his fist against the steering wheel so hard the horn blared into the empty parking lot, and then he just sat there chest-heaving, staring at the restaurant door like it had personally betrayed him. 3 years of silence. 3 years of swallowing grief whole. And his best friend had just done this to him. But here's the thing. Nobody tells you about the night that changes your life. It rarely looks like anything special when it arrives. Drop a comment with your city below. I want to see how far this story travels, and if no one's told you today, subscribe. You're exactly who this channel was made for. The night it all started, Commander James Calloway did something he hadn't done in 3 years. He lied to his daughter. Not a big lie. Not the kind that collapses a man's character. Just a small, stupid, cowardly lie. The kind a tired father tells a 6-year-old because he doesn't have the energy to explain that the world stopped making complete sense the day her mother died. "Daddy's going to dinner with Uncle Derek and Aunt Pam," he said, crouching down in front of little May, smoothing a crease on her pajama collar that didn't need smoothing. "Just the 4 of us. Grown-up stuff." May looked at him with those enormous brown eyes, her mother's eyes. God help him, the exact same shade, the exact same shape, and she tilted her head to one side like she was filing away information for later. 4, she said. 4, he confirmed. "Me, Derek, Pam, and—" He paused. "Derek's co-worker." May considered this with the gravity of a federal judge. Then she reached up and patted his cheek with one small hand, the way she always did when she thought he was being sad without realizing it. "Okay, Daddy," she said. "But you have to laugh at least one time." He kissed her forehead and told the babysitter he'd be back by 9. He was already sweating through his collar before he hit the highway. James Calloway had earned the rank of Navy Commander the hard way, 12 years of deployments, 3 combat tours, 2 commendations, and a work ethic that his commanding officer once described as either inspiring or alarming, depending on the day. He was the kind of man who could keep his voice level while a storm was pulling his ship sideways, and who could write a condolence letter to a sailor's widow at 2 in the morning and still report for duty at 5. He had learned to control almost everything in his environment through sheer discipline and methodical routine. But grief had made a fool of him, same as it does everyone. His wife Claire died 38 months ago. Pulmonary embolism. Sudden, silent, and absolutely without mercy. She had kissed him goodbye at the hospital entrance after a routine checkup. A routine checkup. He still couldn't say those words without feeling the absurdity of them, and then she was gone before he made it back to base. May had been 2.5 years old. She barely remembered her mother now, and somehow that was worse than if she'd remembered everything. James had done what men of his generation and training do. He absorbed it. He buried it under work, under routine, under the very specific and relentless focus required to be both a naval officer and a single father to a little girl who needed her bedtime songs sung exactly right, and her toast cut into triangles, never squares. He did not date. He did not browse apps. He did not accept setups. He did not attend singles events at the Navy Chapel. And he had very politely but very firmly declined every well-meaning attempt by friends, colleagues, and even his own mother to nudge him back into the world of romantic possibility. He was fine. He always said he was fine. He had almost convinced himself. The restaurant was called the Harborside. Waterfront. Nice, but not the kind of nice that was trying too hard. Derek had suggested it weeks ago. "Just dinner, brother. You need to eat. You're always eating alone or grabbing something at the commissary." And James had agreed mostly because May had tilted her head at him over breakfast that morning and said, "Uncle Derek's right. Daddy, you do eat alone a lot." Being corrected by a 6-year-old was a special kind of humbling. He pulled into the parking lot at 7:15, exactly on time, because James Calloway was constitutionally incapable of being late. He sat in the car for 4 minutes, staring at the restaurant's entrance, running a thumb along the edge of his steering wheel. He had this low, persistent feeling that something was off. He couldn't name it. It sat in his chest like a frequency he couldn't tune out. He got out of the car. Derek was already at the entrance wearing that grin, that specific Derek Morrison grin that James had known for 11 years, the one that meant the man was either extremely pleased with himself or about to admit to something inadvisable. James stopped walking. Derek. Jimmy. Why are you grinning like that? I'm just glad to see you, man. Come on, Pam's already inside. She got us a great table. Derek. Derek stopped. His grin softened just slightly into something more careful, more deliberate. And in that half-second of recalibration, James felt the pieces click together in a way that made his jaw tighten. How many people are at that table? He said very quietly. Derek put both hands in his pockets. 4. You said 4 earlier. You and Pam and me and a coworker. Right. Is the coworker a woman? A beat. She's great, Jimmy. James turned around and walked 4 steps back toward the parking lot. Jimmy. I drove 40 minutes for this, Derek. He kept his voice completely flat, which was somehow more alarming than if he'd raised it. 40 minutes. I got May settled. I told the babysitter I'd be back by 9. I put on a collared shirt, which I want you to appreciate because that shirt is dry clean only. Listen to me. You set me up. James turned back around, and his eyes were doing the thing they did when he was genuinely angry. Very still, very focused. You told me it was dinner with friends. It is dinner with friends. Derek held both hands up, palms out like he was trying to manage a situation on a ship deck. She's my friend, Pam's friend. She's a great person, and all you have to do is eat food and have one conversation with a human woman. That's it. That's the entire ask. The ask was dinner. The ask is still dinner. The meal is still happening. The food is still there. James stared at him for a long moment. I'm not ready for this, he said, and he said it quietly without drama, which is what made it land hard. Derek's expression shifted. The salesman energy dropped away completely, and what replaced it was something older and more honest. The face of a man who had watched his friend disappear into himself for 3 years and had finally decided to do something about it, even if it cost him a friendship for a week. I know you're not ready, Derek said. That's exactly why Pam and I are going to be sitting right there at the same table the whole time. You're not being ambushed, James. You're just being asked to show up. That's all. The words sat in the air between them. James looked at the restaurant, looked back at Derek, ran a hand over his jaw. If she's boring, I'm leaving at 8:30. Derek's grin came back slightly more controlled this time. She's not boring. If she asks me about my hero journey or whether I've processed my trauma, I'm leaving immediately. She's not going to do that. And if Pam looks at me with that face she makes, I'll tell her not to make the face. James exhaled through his nose and walked toward the door. The table was good near the window harbor view, far enough from the kitchen that you could actually hear a conversation. Pam was already seated, and she stood up when she saw him, and James noted with cautious appreciation that she did not in fact make the face. She hugged him and said he looked thin, and immediately began telling him about her sister's new dog, which was either genuine social grace or a masterclass in distraction. He sat down. There were 4 place settings. The 4th chair was empty. He ordered water and studied the menu with more concentration than it deserved, because studying the menu meant he didn't have to look at the empty chair or think about who was going to fill it, or whether he was going to embarrass himself, or whether this was a catastrophically bad idea, or whether May's brown eyes had been right that morning when she'd watched him from across the breakfast table like she already knew something he didn't. Then Pam looked up past his shoulder, and her face did a small genuine thing. Not the face, something warmer than the face, and she said, "There she is." James heard footsteps. He made himself not turn around immediately. 1 second. 2. Then he turned. The woman was walking toward the table with the ease of someone who knew exactly who she was and had made peace with it. She wasn't performing. She wasn't scanning the room to check if people were watching. She moved like someone arriving somewhere she'd already decided to be, and that specificity, that quiet self-possession, caught James off guard before she'd even reached the table. She wore a simple blue dress. No jewelry except small gold earrings. Her hair was pulled back a few strands loose around her face. She looked, he thought, like someone who had figured out that the point wasn't to look like an occasion. The point was to actually be present. She stopped at the empty chair, looked directly at him, and smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a performed smile, but the real kind. The kind that reaches the corners of a person's eyes, before it reaches their mouth. "Hi," she said. "I'm Dr. Nora Whitfield." A small pause. And before anyone has to do the awkward explanation, "I know this is a setup. Pam told me. So." She pulled out her chair and sat down with a kind of deliberate calm. "I'm your blind date." James blinked. Pam made a small sound beside him that she immediately covered by reaching for her water glass. Derek, to his credit, looked at the menu with intense focus. James looked at Nora Whitfield for a moment. This woman who had walked in and immediately diffused the tension he'd been carrying since the parking lot by simply naming the situation out loud. And then before he could stop it, something released in his chest. Not a lot, just enough. "Well," he said slowly, "at least we don't have to pretend." Nora raised her water glass slightly. "My absolute least favorite thing." "What pretending?" "Pretending," she confirmed. "And small talk. And also," she glanced at the menu, "I'm going to order the salmon, and I need you to know that up front because Derek told me you're a steak person, and I want there to be no illusions." James felt something strange happening in the region of his face. He was almost smiling. He hadn't almost smiled at a stranger in a very long time. "I respect the salmon," he said carefully. "Thank you," Nora said. "That's a very good start." They were an hour into dinner before James realized he had forgotten to feel uncomfortable. He noticed it the way you notice a headache is gone, not while it's happening, but suddenly, as a fact, after the fact. He was talking. Actually talking, not performing conversation, or deflecting with Navy anecdotes, or doing the polite half-present thing he'd learned to do at social obligations over the past 3 years. Nora Whitfield was a children's trauma therapist. She worked primarily with military families, kids whose parents deployed, kids who were managing lost kids who'd moved 6 times in 8 years and were trying to build identity on moving ground. She spoke about her work the way James spoke about his own, not to impress, but because it was simply the thing that occupied most of the interior of her life. She was 41, she told him, because she'd asked him first, and he'd said 38, and she'd said, "Good, I always trust 38s. They've had enough time to figure out 1 or 2 things, but they're not finished yet." She had never been married. Had been close once, a long engagement that had dissolved quietly like sugar in warm water, neither dramatic nor sudden, but simply the slow recognition that 2 people had grown in completely different directions. "Do you regret it?" James asked. She thought about it genuinely, which he appreciated. No automatic answer. "I regret the years I spent believing it was going to fix itself," she said finally. "I don't regret how it ended. Some things ending is the kindest possible outcome." James turned his water glass slowly in his hands. "My wife didn't get an ending like that," he said. "It was just gone. One day there and then not." He hadn't meant to say that. It came out of him the way things come out sometimes when you've been carrying them so long they just decide to surface on their own terms. Nora didn't reach across the table, didn't make a therapeutic sound. She just looked at him with direct, quiet attention and said, "I'm sorry. That kind of loss doesn't have edges. It just keeps being large." He exhaled. "Yeah." "How long?" 3 years and 2 months. "And your daughter?" "May." Saying her name out loud at a dinner table in the middle of what was technically a date felt strange and also completely natural. "She's 6. She was 2 when it happened. She doesn't really remember Claire." Something moved across Nora's expression. "That's its own kind of grief for a child," she said softly. "Mourning someone you never got to fully know. She asked me once," James said, "if she could grieve someone she couldn't remember, like she thought she didn't have the right to be sad about it." Nora was quiet for a moment. "What did you tell her?" "I told her grief doesn't have a membership requirement." He paused. "I don't know if that was right." "It was exactly right," Nora said, and she said it with a certainty that had nothing performative in it. "I've worked with children who lost parents before they could form lasting memories, and the grief is absolutely real. The absence shapes them whether or not they have the conscious memory to frame it." James looked at her. "Sorry," she said, catching herself. You probably didn't come here for a clinical framework. No, he said. I actually know. I didn't mind it. A small beat. Tell me more about May, Nora said. And James Calloway, who had not talked about May to anyone who wasn't Derek or his mother or May's teacher, in longer than he could calculate, found that he wanted to. He told her May's Wednesday morning ritual, the one where she had to check that all her stuffed animals were positioned correctly before school, because she was convinced they got lonely and disorganized while she was gone. He told her about the reading project at school, where May had chosen to write about deep-sea fish, because in her words, nobody ever thinks about the fish at the very bottom, Daddy, but they're still there. He told her about the nightmares that had come in waves through May's 3rd and 4th years, the ones where she'd wake up calling for a mother whose face she couldn't picture, and how James had learned to sit on the edge of her bed in the dark for exactly as long as it took, not speaking, just present. Nora listened the way very few people listen, like she was genuinely storing what he said, turning it over, understanding it rather than waiting to respond. She sounds like a kid who is doing the extraordinary work of holding things together, Nora said, and a kid who has a father she trusts enough to be uncertain in front of. I don't always know what I'm doing, James admitted. That's the only honest thing any parent can say. Derek made a small noise across the table that James suspected was suppressed satisfaction. He did not acknowledge it. What made you say yes? James asked. To tonight. Pam said you don't usually do these. Nora considered him. She said you were a good man who was forgetting how to live because he was so focused on not falling apart. She picked up her wine glass. I found that honest enough to be worth showing up for. James was quiet for a moment. She's not wrong, he said finally, and it cost him something to say it, which is how he knew it was true. At 8:45, 15 minutes past the hard exit time, he'd set for himself in the parking lot. James excused himself to call the babysitter. He stood near the hostess stand, phone to his ear, and listened to the babysitter tell him May had gone to bed on time, and had specifically requested that James not rush, because she's fine and he needs the practice. He stared at his phone after he hung up. She's fine and he needs the practice. His 6-year-old daughter had diagnosed him correctly from 20 miles away. He walked back to the table. Pam was telling a story about a home renovation disaster. Derek was contributing with great enthusiasm, and Nora was laughing. Really laughing. Head tilted back slightly, completely unguarded, and the sound of it did something to the air in the room that James couldn't immediately classify. He sat back down. Everything okay? Nora asked, turning to him. The babysitter says May wants me to not rush. Nora smiled. Smart kid. She's smarter than me, James said. I've basically accepted that. Sounds like my kind of kid. And there it was. That sentence, said simply without agenda or implication, just straightforward warmth for a child she'd never met. James filed it away somewhere he hadn't accessed in 3 years. He stayed until 10:15 p.m. In the parking lot, Derek shook his hand with entirely too much enthusiasm, and Pam hugged him for a beat longer than usual. He let her. Nora walked to her car, which was parked 2 spots from his. The harbor was loud with wind off the water, and the parking lot lights had that particular yellow quality that made everything look quieter than it was. Thank you for not leaving at 8:30, she said. He stopped. How did you know about 8:30? Derek told me about you. Her expression was calm, not teasing. He said you'd set yourself a hard exit time. He just didn't tell me what it was. 8:30, James said. I'll consider it a compliment that you didn't use it. He turned his car keys over in his hand. The wind off the harbor was cold, the kind of cold that goes through a collar and sits at the back of the neck, and he was aware that this was the moment where he was supposed to say something decisive or ask for her number, or say goodbye in a way that meant something, and he felt all of that converging. And instead what came out was honest and unpolished, and he thought afterward, probably the most accurate thing he'd said all night. I don't know what I'm doing, he said. I want to be upfront about that. Nora looked at him. I haven't done this in 3 years, he continued. I'm not casual about things. I don't know how to be not serious. I have a daughter who is the most important thing in my life, and a job that sends me away without a lot of notice, and I'm—" He stopped, exhaled. "I'm not a simple situation." Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Commander Calloway." She said it carefully, like she was measuring the weight of the name. "I work with families who have been broken by the specific gravity of what you carry. I know what it costs. I'm not looking for a simple situation." A pause. "I'm also not in a hurry." The harbor wind moved between them. James looked at her for a long moment. This woman he had known for approximately 3 hours, who had named the situation before she sat down and diffused his armor. Before he'd known she was doing it, and listened to him talk about his daughter, with a quality of attention that still felt standing in the cold parking lot more valuable than almost anything he'd been given in years. "Can I call you?" he said. "Yes," she said simply. "I'll text you my number." She got in her car. He stood for a moment in the parking lot before he got in his. Driving home, the city lights smearing across his windshield in the rain that had started without him noticing, he thought about May's instruction. Laugh at least one time. He had laughed. More than once. He didn't know what came next. He didn't know what he was ready for, or what would be asked of him, or how any of this fit into a life that was already operating at its structural limits. But somewhere around the third stoplight from the harbor, he noticed that the frequency in his chest, the low persistent discomfort that had been there since the parking lot was gone. He drove home in the quiet of its absence, and that felt for the first time in a very long time like enough. May was asleep when he got home. He stood in her doorway for a full minute, watching her breathe in the dark, her stuffed animals arranged in their exact correct positions around her. Then he went to the kitchen, sat at the table, and waited for his phone to buzz with a number he hadn't asked for yet. Somehow already knew was going to matter. It did. He sat there looking at it for a long time before he saved it. The first text he sent her was at 7:14 in the morning, 2 days after the dinner. He'd been awake since 5. May's doing not insomnia, because May had decided at 5 a.m. that her fish report needed a diagram of the ocean's depth zones, and could Daddy draw a fish that looked kind of sad, but also peaceful, because that's how deep-sea fish feel. And by the time he'd dropped her at school and come back to an empty kitchen with a full cup of coffee and nothing demanding, his immediate attention, he was sitting at the table, staring at Nora's number in his phone, like it was a document that required review before signing. He typed, "Good morning. This is James Calloway. We met at the harborside on Friday." He stared at it. Deleted it. Typed, "Hi. It's James. From dinner." Stared at that. Deleted it. Poured more coffee. Stood at the kitchen window. Came back. Typed, "May finished her deep-sea fish report. The fish she drew looks mournful but dignified. I thought you should know." He sent it before he could analyze it, because analysis was how he'd talked himself out of things for 3 years, and he was making a deliberate decision at 7:14 on a Tuesday morning to stop doing that. 3 minutes passed. Then mournful but dignified is an excellent artistic direction. What species? He exhaled something he hadn't realized he was holding. Anglerfish, he wrote back. She says nobody appreciates them. She's right. They're extraordinary and deeply misunderstood. Tell her a marine biologist agrees. You're a marine biologist now. I'm whatever the situation requires. That's what 10 years of therapy work does to you. He was smiling at his phone in an empty kitchen at 7:17 in the morning, and it felt ridiculous, and also quietly like something he hadn't known he was starving for. They talked every day after that. Not always long conversations, sometimes just a message in the morning, a response in the evening, a short exchange in the 45 minutes between May's bedtime and James's own. But the consistency of it built something. He noticed it the way you notice a structure going up, not the individual bricks, but the shape that starts to emerge. She told him about a session she'd had with a 7-year-old boy whose father had just returned from a 9-month deployment and who didn't know how to let his dad back in. He kept putting himself between his dad and his mom every time they were in the same room, Nora said. Not out of anger, out of protection. He'd appointed himself the family's structural support while his dad was gone, and he didn't know how to unappoint himself. James was quiet for a moment. "What did you do?" "I had a session with the father first, alone. Told him that the best thing he could do wasn't to try to reclaim his position. It was to let his son show him what he'd been carrying, let the kid teach him, then rebuild from there." "Did it work?" "Slowly, but slowly is fine. Slowly means it's real." James thought about May, about all the small ways she had organized herself around his absence and his grief, the way she managed her own bedtime on the nights he was too exhausted, the way she brought him water without being asked, the way she sometimes looked at him with that head tilt that meant she was taking his emotional temperature. He'd been so focused on taking care of her that he hadn't fully registered how much she'd been quietly taking care of him. "I think May does that," he said. "The structural support thing." "I wondered," Nora said carefully. "You could tell from what I told you at dinner. I could tell from how you talked about her." A pause. "Kids who become their parents' emotional anchor develop a specific kind of vigilance. It's not harmful necessarily if the parent is aware of it and makes space for the kid to also just be a kid." "Am I doing that wrong?" She didn't answer immediately, and he appreciated that she didn't rush to reassure him. "I think you're doing everything you know how to do with genuine love," she said finally. "That's the foundation. The awareness is something you build on top of it." He sat with that for a long time after the call ended. 3 weeks after the dinner, Derek called him on a Sunday afternoon with the specific kind of casual energy that meant he was actually calling for information. "So," Derek said. "So," James said. "You texted me a picture of coffee 2 days ago." "I did." The caption was, "She also drinks this." "You texted me a coffee with the caption, 'She also drinks this.'" James opened his mouth, closed it. "I was making conversation." "You were telling me you had coffee with her." "I was at a coffee shop near the base. She was also at a coffee shop, different coffee shop. We were texting about it." "James." "Derek." "My friend." Derek's voice shifted into something between amusement and genuine warmth. "I have known you for 11 years. You once gave me a 3-minute briefing on why you would never use the phrase, 'getting to know someone,' because it sounded like a reconnaissance mission dressed up in civilian language." "That's still accurate. You are conducting a reconnaissance mission." James was quiet. He stopped, tried again. "She's easy to talk to." "She's easy to talk to," Derek repeated, savoring this. "James Calloway, who I once watched sit through a 4-hour award ceremony without changing his facial expression, is using the phrase, 'easy to talk to' about a woman." "I'm hanging up. Pam is very happy for the record. Tell Pam to be less obviously happy, it's making me nervous. She's going to be so pleased that you're nervous." James hung up, then immediately sent Derek a text that said, "Don't tell Pam I'm nervous." Then, because that was obviously only going to make things worse, followed it with, "Don't tell Pam. I said, don't tell Pam." He stared at his phone, then sent one more. Forget both of those. Derek sent back a single laughing emoji, which was somehow the most annoying response possible. The first time he mentioned Nora to May, he didn't plan it. It happened the way most significant things in his life happened, sideways without announcement, while he was focused on something else entirely. They were doing May's reading homework at the kitchen table a Tuesday night, both of them in that particular after-dinner quiet that he'd come to love, the settled, ordinary domesticity of it, the feeling of the house having done its job for the day. May was sounding out words with intense concentration, her finger moving beneath each line, and James was half reading along and half thinking about a message Nora had sent that afternoon, about a book she thought he should read, a memoir by a veteran who'd written about rebuilding identity after service, and he was thinking about how she did that, sent him things not to impress him, but because she'd thought of him specifically and thought he'd find it useful. "Daddy?" May said without looking up from her book. "Who's Nora?" He went very still. "Where did you hear that name?" "You said it." May turned a page, still not looking up. "When you were on the phone last night, you said, 'Okay, Nora,' and then you laughed." He had not known she'd heard that. "She's a friend," he said carefully. May considered the page in front of her. Uncle Derek's friend. She knows Uncle Derek and Aunt Pam, yes. Is she nice? I think so, yes. May nodded slowly, the way she did when she was organizing new information. Does she like deep-sea fish? James blinked. She does, actually. Oh, another page turn. That's good. And then, with complete 6-year-old matter-of-factness, she went back to her reading, like she'd simply done a brief data intake, and filed it away for later. James looked at the side of his daughter's head for a moment. Those were her mother's cheekbones. That was Claire's exact shade of brown in her hair. Yeah, he said quietly. It is good. Nora suggested the harbor walk. A Saturday morning in early April, just coffee and walking, nothing that required a table or a menu or the formality of a restaurant. James agreed immediately, and then spent approximately 20 minutes on Friday night staring at his closet, making a decision about a jacket that he refused to let himself examine too closely. They met at the north end of the harbor path at 8:30. She was already there when he arrived. He was 3 minutes early, which meant she was earlier than 3 minutes early, wearing a dark green jacket and holding 2 cups of coffee, like she'd expected to beat him there, and planned for it. You got coffee? He said. I assumed you'd want some? She handed him a cup. Black, no sugar. Derek provided your order in advance. Derek is a comprehensive intelligence leak. He really is. I also know you take your eggs scrambled. You have opinions about proper hospital corners on bed sheets, and you once cried at a nature documentary about sea turtles. I want the record to reflect, James said, accepting the coffee, that the sea turtle documentary was about a mother sea turtle who traveled 1,200 miles to lay her eggs and then... I know, Nora said. Derek told me. I cried at the description alone. They started walking. The harbor in early April was still cold enough that the coffee mattered, and the water was that particular pewter color it gets. Before full spring arrives flat and wide and smelling of brine and something vaguely industrial that James had always found inexplicably calming. They walked side by side without rushing, and it occurred to him that this was the first time in years he'd walked somewhere with another adult that wasn't Derek, and wasn't a colleague. And wasn't May leading him toward whatever she wanted to investigate. Tell me something I don't know about you, Nora said, after a comfortable stretch of quiet. Like what? Anything. Derek gave me the facts. I want something he doesn't know. James thought about it honestly. When I was 24, I almost quit, he said. She glanced at him. The Navy. I'd just come back from my first deployment. It was harder than I'd expected. Not physically, mentally. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. I spent 3 weeks at my parents' house in Georgia, and I seriously considered whether I was built for this, whether it was what I actually wanted, or whether I'd just followed the path that was in front of me because I was good at it. What made you stay? I drove back to the base, he said, and I sat in the parking lot, and I thought about the 20 sailors under my command at the time. Not abstractly specifically. Their names, their faces, the things they'd told me over those months. And I realized that whatever I was struggling with, they were also struggling with, and they needed someone who was willing to stay in the difficulty with them. He paused. So I stayed. And every time it got hard after that, I thought about that parking lot. Nora was quiet for a moment. That's a very specific kind of courage, she said. The kind that isn't about not being afraid. It's about choosing the obligation over the fear. Is that how you'd describe it? That's how I'd describe everything worth doing, she said simply. They walked. Your turn, he said. What do you want to know? Something Derek doesn't know. She smiled slightly, looking at the water. I have a box under my bed, she said. It's got letters in it. Letters I wrote to my mother after she died 15 years ago. I never sent them, obviously. But some days, something will happen. A patient will say something that she would have found exactly the right words for, or I'll see something she would have loved, and I'll go home, and I'll write it down and put it in the box. He didn't say anything immediately. I haven't told many people that, she said. Why are you telling me? She considered it. Because you told me about the parking lot. She glanced at him. I think that's what this is. The real version of getting to know someone. You hand them something true and see what they do with it. James looked at her. I'm going to be careful with that, he said. What you told me. I know, she said, and she said it with a certainty that meant she'd already decided as much before she'd said it. Dear. He introduced May to Nora on a Saturday in late April that May had declared the best possible day for important things, because it was warm enough to be outside, but not so warm that everything felt effortful. James had presented this to Nora with appropriate gravity, and she had received it the same way. The meeting happened at the park near the naval base, May's preferred park, the one with the climbing structure she called the pirate situation. And James arrived first with May on his shoulders, which was her preferred mode of arrival at the park, even though she was 6 and increasingly heavy, and James suspected she was going to still want to be carried on his shoulders at 17, and he was choosing not to examine how he felt about that. May saw Nora before James had time to do any sort of formal introduction. She slid off his shoulders, landed with both feet, and assessed Nora from about 8 feet away, with the direct, unsentimental gaze of a child who has decided something important is happening and is gathering data accordingly. Nora didn't crouch down to May's level. James noticed that and appreciated it. Some adults meeting kids performed a kind of exaggerated getting small that children always saw through. Nora simply stopped walking and met May's gaze straight on and said, "Hi, I've heard you're an anglerfish expert." May's entire assessment process visibly recalibrated. "I'm not an expert yet," May said seriously. "I'm still learning, but I know more than most people." "That's actually the exact definition of expert," Nora said. "An expert is just someone who knows more than most people and is still learning. That's you." May thought about this. "Okay," she said with the tone of someone revising their position. "Then yes, I'm an expert." "Can I see the pirate situation?" Nora asked, nodding toward the climbing structure. May turned around and walked directly toward it without further preamble, which was as close to an invitation as she gave. James fell into step beside Nora. He didn't say anything. He was watching his daughter walk ahead of them through the warm April light, confident and small, and holding the world like she owned a reasonable portion of it. "She's extraordinary," Nora said quietly, not to be heard by May. "Yeah," James said. "She really is." For the next hour and 20 minutes, May explained the pirate situation to Nora in comprehensive detail, including the specific rules of engagement, the structural weaknesses that required tactical adaptation, and the correct way to descend the far side without getting your shoe stuck. Nora listened with absolute unperforming attention and asked exactly the right questions at exactly the right moments. The kind of questions that meant she was actually interested rather than being indulgent. At one point, May stopped, mid-explanation, looked at Nora with great focus, and said, "You listen like you're going to remember." Nora looked back at her. "I am going to remember." May nodded slowly, decided something, and then climbed the pirate situation's main structure and said, "Watch this part, it's the best part," and proceeded to demonstrate a descent method that made James's pulse spike briefly before he confirmed she'd landed correctly. "She does that to make you nervous," Nora said quietly beside him. "I know," James said. "I still can't not be nervous." "That's fatherhood," Nora said simply, and the simplicity of it, the way she said it without any agenda attached, settled somewhere in his chest and stayed. When they were leaving, May walked between them on the path back to the parking lot holding James's hand. After about 30 seconds, she reached up with her other hand and without ceremony or announcement took Nora's hand too. James watched it happen in his peripheral vision. He didn't say anything. Neither did Nora. May swung both their hands slightly as she walked focused on the path ahead, apparently satisfied with her arrangement. May arrived, and the rhythm of things between them deepened. Coffee walks, occasional dinners. He met 2 of her colleagues, warm, smart women, who worked with her at the Family Services Clinic, and who looked at him with an entirely appropriate level of calibration, trying to figure out who he was without being obvious about it. He took that as a good sign. People who cared about Nora were paying attention to who she was spending time with. He made her dinner one night at his house a Sunday. May's early bedtime. The kind of quiet evening that in another era he might have filled with paperwork or patrol schedules or the low hum of cable news in an empty living room. He cooked pasta because that was something he actually knew how to do without pretending, and Nora brought bread and wine and arrived with the specific comfort of someone who was not visiting but simply arriving somewhere they'd agreed to be. They ate at his kitchen table, the same table where he'd sat in the dark 3 years running, eating reheated dinners alone, and the table felt like a different object under those circumstances. "This is good," she said about the pasta. "Don't sound surprised," he said. "I'm not surprised. Derek told me you could cook. I was just confirming." "Derek tells you everything. He really does. He told me you once made Thanksgiving dinner for 8 sailors who had nowhere to go, and you used 3 different slow cookers and organized it like a logistics operation." James was quiet for a moment. "That was 5 years ago." "He thinks you're remarkable," she said without any edge to it. "He's been your friend for over a decade, and he still thinks you're remarkable. That's not a common thing." James looked at his plate. "He's the one who kept me upright after Claire died, him and Pam. I don't know if I ever actually told them how much that mattered." "Maybe you should tell them." "I probably should." "People like Derek," Nora said, "think they know their value. They usually don't, not fully. It's worth being explicit." He looked at her across his kitchen table. "You do that," he said, "with people. You see what people need to hear and then you say it, without making it a big production." "It's less of a gift and more of an occupational hazard," she said. "No," he said. "It's a gift. Don't minimize it." She looked at him. Something shifted slightly in her expression. Not discomfort, but something close to being seen and not quite knowing how to receive it. "Okay," she said quietly. "Thank you." "You're welcome." They sat for a moment in the kitchen's quiet. Then Nora said, "James?" "Yeah." "I want to be honest with you about something." He set his fork down. Not because he was alarmed, but because she'd said it with enough weight that the conversation deserved his full attention. "Okay," he said. "I've been careful," she said, "about this, us, what this is becoming." She looked at the table for a second, then back at him. "I've been in situations before where I moved at someone else's pace because I thought it was the right thing, and what I ended up with was years of my life on a rhythm that wasn't mine. So..." She paused. "I need you to know that I'm not in a hurry. I meant that when I said it. But I'm not interested in indefinite." She met his eyes directly. "I need you to know what you're doing, what we're doing, when you're ready to know that." The kitchen was quiet, except for a faint sound from the direction of May's room that resolved into nothing, just the house settling. James looked at Nora across the table. This woman who had walked into a restaurant 2 months ago and named the situation before she sat down, who had made him talk about May in ways he hadn't talked to anyone, who had held his daughter's hand on a park path without being asked and understood exactly what that meant without making it larger than it was. "I'm not in a hurry either," he said. "But I'm not confused about what this is." He held her gaze. "I know what I'm doing." She studied him for a moment, the kind of looking that is actually considering rather than performing consideration. Then she nodded. Once. Decisively. "Okay," she said. "Good." And then she reached across the table and picked up her wine glass and said, "Now can we talk about the pasta, because I genuinely want the recipe and I'm not going to pretend I don't." James laughed, surprised, full real. The kind of laugh that comes from somewhere below the performance of okayness. "It's not complicated," he said. "The best things usually aren't," she said. The night in late May, when he came closest to calling it off, had nothing to do with Nora and everything to do with him. He'd gotten a call from the base at 6 in the morning, a scheduling conversation about a maritime readiness exercise that would pull him away for 12 days in June. 12 days was nothing by deployment standards. He'd been gone for 8 months. But something about standing in his kitchen in the gray morning light, listening to the logistics being laid out while May slept down the hall, and thinking simultaneously about what 12 days meant for Nora, and whether this was fair to anyone, the accumulated weight of it all hit him in the back of the knees. He called Nora at 9 after May was at school. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Okay. I'm going to be away for 12 days in June, maritime exercise, and when I come back there's a real possibility, better than real actually, that I'm being looked at for a humanitarian mission. Extended. 4 months, maybe more. Limited communication." Silence on the line. Not the bad kind, the processing kind. He'd learned to tell the difference. "When would you know?" she asked. "August, maybe July if the timeline moves." Another pause. "James?" "I know," he said. "I know what I'm asking. I know what this costs people who—" "Stop," she said. "Just stop for a second." He stopped. "You didn't ask me anything," she said. "You told me a fact about your life. A fact that was true before we met, and is still true. I knew you were Navy. I knew what that meant when I sat down at that table." Her voice was steady, not performing calm, but actually calm. "I'm not going to fall apart because your job is real. 4 months is 4 months is 4 months, she said. "It's not forever. I'm not a person who confuses long with impossible." He exhaled slowly. "I don't want to disappear on you." "Then don't disappear on me. Be where you are fully for as long as you're here. That's not complicated." A pause. "And when you go, you tell me. And when you come back, you come back. We figure out the rest." He sat down at the kitchen table. "You make this sound simpler than it is," he said. "No," she said. "I make it sound possible. Those are different things. Possible is harder than simple. Possible requires actual choice every single time." A beat. "Are you choosing James?" He looked at his kitchen. At the table where they'd had dinner. At May's drawing of the mournful, dignified anglerfish that was still taped to the refrigerator. "Yes," he said. "I'm choosing." "Then that's enough," Nora said. "For right now, that's genuinely enough." In the last week of May, Nora took May to a Saturday morning program at the city aquarium. James had a morning obligation at the base, and May had been asking about the aquarium's deep-sea exhibit with an intensity that bordered on academic urgency. Nora had offered. James had almost said no, some reflex of not wanting to impose, before May had looked at him from the breakfast table and said simply, "Daddy, say yes." He said yes. When he picked May up at noon, his daughter walked to the car with the specific energy of a person who has had a profoundly satisfactory experience and is internally organizing how to report it. She got in the car. "How was it?" James asked. "She knows things, Daddy," May said with great seriousness. "Like real things. About the fish. She didn't make any of it up." A pause. "I tested her." "You tested her?" "I asked her 3 things I already knew the answers to. She got them all right." James glanced in the rearview mirror at his daughter's face, wholly serious, completely satisfied, her brown eyes bright. "So she passed," he said. "She passed." May confirmed, and then with the matter-of-fact certainty that only a 6-year-old can deliver without any awareness of its weight, "She's a keeper, Daddy." James looked at the road. He felt something move through him, not quite a decision, because the decision had already been made. He understood that now, but more like a confirmation. The quiet arriving of a thing that had been true for a while, and was simply now being formally acknowledged. "Yeah, May," he said. "She really is." The deployment orders came on a Wednesday. Not the Wednesday James had been bracing for. July was what the base commander had indicated. Maybe late July, if the humanitarian mission timeline held. But military timelines don't hold, which is something every sailor knows. The way they know the color of the sea in different weather. And when Senior Chief Petty Officer Harmon knocked on James's office door at 2:17 in the afternoon, with the specific expression that meant paperwork had arrived with urgency attached to it, James already knew before the envelope was on his desk. He read the orders twice, folded the paper once along its original crease, set it down. "When does command need confirmation?" he asked. 48 hours, sir," Harmon said. "Thank you, Senior Chief." Harmon left. James sat at his desk for 4 minutes without moving, which was the closest thing to falling apart that he allowed himself during working hours. The mission was real. a naval humanitarian operation off the coast of a region where flooding had displaced over 40,000 people and where the local infrastructure had collapsed badly enough that international naval presence was the fastest way to get medical supplies, clean water, and emergency personnel into coastal communities that had no other access. It was necessary work. It was the kind of mission he had joined the Navy to be part of. He knew all of that. He believed all of that. He also knew that May's 7th birthday was in November, and that he was looking at a departure date of late August, which meant he would almost certainly miss it. He picked the paper up again, read it a third time, looked at the departure date. Then he picked up his phone and called Nora. She answered on the second ring. "Hey." Her voice had that particular quality it always had in the mid-afternoon, focused but warm, like she was between sessions and had picked up because it was him. "What's wrong?" "How do you know something's wrong?" "You called instead of texting, and it's 2:30 on a Wednesday." He exhaled. The orders came. A beat of silence. Then, "How long?" "Minimum 4 months. Could extend to 6 depending on how the humanitarian situation develops." He paused. "Departure is late August." He could hear her breathing steady and measured the way she got when she was processing something that required more than surface-level response. "May's birthday is in November," she said. "Yeah." "Does she know yet?" "No, I just got the paperwork 20 minutes ago." "Okay." Another measured breath. "When are you home tonight?" 6, maybe 6:30. "I'll come over," she said, not as a question. "You shouldn't sit with this alone all evening." He almost said he was fine. Almost said she didn't need to. He caught both of those sentences before they left his mouth, because he'd been working on catching those sentences, had been working on it since the night she'd asked him directly. "Are you choosing?" And he'd said yes and meant it. "Okay," he said. "Thank you." "James?" "Yeah, this is what you do," she said quietly. "This is who you are. I knew that at dinner. Nothing about those orders is a surprise about you. It's just a date on a calendar that we didn't have before." 4 months is a long time, he said. "You've been gone 8, she said. "I know your record, and you came back. You always come back." A pause. "Just come home tonight. We'll talk." He told May at dinner. He'd thought about it all the way home, how to frame it, what words to use, how much a 6-year-old needed to know versus what would only frighten her. He'd gone through approximately 9 different versions of the conversation in his head by the time he pulled into the driveway, and then May had opened the front door before he'd even reached the porch, because she'd heard the car, and she'd looked at his face with those precise brown eyes and said, "Daddy, what happened?" And the 9 rehearsed versions evaporated. He sat on the front step. She sat next to him. He looked at the street for a moment, then looked at her. "I have to go away for a while," he said. "For work. The Navy needs me to go on a ship and help people who were hurt by floods. People who don't have food or clean water and need help getting it." May looked at him carefully. "How long is a while?" "Maybe 4 months, maybe longer." She was quiet for a moment. He watched her processing it, the small internal machinery of a 7-year-old confronting the specific absence she knew better than any other. "Will you be home for my birthday?" she asked. He met her eyes. He'd decided driving home that he would not lie to her. Not about this. "I don't think so, Bug," he said. "I'm sorry." Her face did something complicated, not crying, not yet something more interior than that. The expression of a child absorbing information that hurts and deciding what to do with it. "Are you going to be safe?" she asked. "Yes. It's not a fighting mission. We're bringing help to people who need it. It's the good kind of going." "Is there a good kind?" The question cut straight through him. "I think so," he said. "The kind where you go because someone needs what you have, and you're the one who can give it. That's the good kind." May looked at the street. Her small shoulders rose and fell with one long breath. "Okay," she said finally. "Okay." "I'm sad," she clarified with the matter-of-fact honesty that he both loved and found almost unbearably moving about her. "But okay." She looked up at him. "Will Nora be here while you're gone?" He hadn't expected that question in that moment. Is that what you want? May looked at him like the answer was obvious. She passed the test, Daddy, she said simply. And then she got up and went back inside because dinner wasn't finished and she was hungry. And James sat on the front step alone for another minute in the fading August light, feeling the full weight of what was coming, and also beneath it something that held. Nora arrived at 7. May was already in her pajamas. She'd insisted on getting ready for bed early because she had, as she told James with great dignity, a lot of thinking to do tonight, and I needed to be comfortable. James had tucked her in with an extra 15 minutes of reading, and she'd fallen asleep mid-chapter, which meant the thinking had been thorough enough to exhaust her. He and Nora sat at the kitchen table. He made coffee. She held her cup with both hands and looked at him the way she did when she was letting him arrive at what he needed to say, without pushing him there. I almost put in a request, he said. She looked up. To decline. To delay. There's a process. It's not common, but it's not impossible. I could cite family hardship. He looked at his coffee cup. I'd be justified. Single parent, no immediate family in the area. But you're not going to, she said. It wasn't a question. No. Why are you telling me you considered it? He thought about that. Because I wanted you to know it crossed my mind. That I'm not choosing this over you or over May, because I don't care about the choice. I care, and I'm still going. And I needed someone to know both things at the same time. Nora set her cup down. I know both things at the same time, she said. I've known both things since you told me on the phone today. You didn't need to explain it. A pause. But I'm glad you did. He looked at her across his kitchen table, this table that had become a different object since she'd started sitting at it. Are you angry? No. She said it simply. I'm not angry. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't going to miss you because I am, and it's going to be hard, and 4 months is a long time to navigate without someone's voice in your ear that you've gotten used to having there. She met his eyes. But I'm not angry. You're doing something that matters. And being angry at you for that would be like being angry at the tide for going out. He paused. That's a generous way to see it. It's the accurate way, she said. The generous way would be pretending I'm fine with it before I've sat with it long enough to be actually fine with it. She picked her cup back up. Ask me again in 2 weeks. He almost smiled. Will you be fine with it in 2 weeks? Ask me in 2 weeks. Fair enough. They sat in quiet for a moment. Then Nora said, May asked if I'd be here, while you're gone. She told me the same. What did you tell her? I asked her if that was what she wanted. He looked at her. She said you passed the test. Something moved across Nora's face. Not quite a smile, something older and more tender than a smile. She told me about the test, she said quietly. At the aquarium. She explained the methodology. I was genuinely impressed. She's rigorous. She's extraordinary. Nora was quiet for a moment. James, I want you to hear me say this clearly because I need you to take it with you when you go and not waste any time at sea second-guessing it. She looked at him steadily. I will be here. I will be here for May, and I will be here for you when you come back. Not because I feel obligated, and not because I think it's the thing a good person does. Because I want to be. Because she matters to me, and you matter to me. And that's not going to change because you're on a ship 4,000 miles away. She paused. But I need you to promise me something in return. What? Don't disappear inside yourself over there, she said. Write when you can. Tell me the real things. Not the briefing version, the real version. I've worked with enough sailors coming home to know what happens when you spend months not processing what you're experiencing, and I'm not going to do that with you. She held his gaze. Deal. He looked at her for a long moment. Deal, he said. She extended her hand across the table, formal and deliberate, the way she'd done once before at the harbor, when she'd said she wasn't in a hurry, but she wasn't interested in indefinite either. He took it, shook it once, held it for a beat longer. I'm going to miss you, he said. and he said it like someone who had decided to stop managing how honest he was allowed to be. "I know," she said. "I'm going to miss you too." She didn't let go of his hand. "Now tell me what you need to do in the next 3 weeks before you go. Logistically. The May plan, the house situation, the emergency contacts, all of it. Let's make a list. Right now? Right now. Because that's what you actually need from me tonight, and we both know it. The feelings part we can revisit. The logistics part needs to start now." He stared at her. "I really—" He stopped. "You really what? I really wasn't expecting you," he said. "When Derek set this up, I wasn't expecting any of it." She looked at him with that steady, direct gaze. "Neither was I," she said. "Now. May's school contact information. Who's the primary after you?" He pulled out his phone, and they worked for the next 2 hours at the kitchen table. And when she left at 10 o'clock, and the house was quiet, and James was standing in May's doorway, looking at his daughter sleeping in the dark, he felt underneath the weight of what was coming, the specific and unfamiliar solidity of not being alone in the wait. The 3 weeks before departure moved the way time moves, when you're both savoring it, and running from it too fast in the mornings, unbearably slow at 2 in the afternoon, and then suddenly gone. He and Nora spent as much of it together as his pre-deployment obligations allowed. She came to the house 4 evenings out of 7. They took May to the beach one Saturday. May's request because she wanted to practice being at the ocean so it feels normal when Daddy's there, which was the kind of 6-year-old logic that James had long since accepted as more sophisticated than it appeared. May ran at the water's edge with the total investment that children bring to everything physical, and James and Nora sat on a beach blanket and watched her, and James said, "She's going to be different when I get back." "Kids always are," Nora said. "I missed things last time. She started reading in the 6 months I was gone. I came home, and she could read." He paused. "I found out by watching her read a cereal box at breakfast." "That must have been hard." "I cried in the bathroom for about 4 minutes and then came out and made her read me the whole cereal box twice," he said. "I was so proud I couldn't stand it." Nora laughed softly. "What cereal?" "Honey Nut Cheerios." "The reading level is moderate, but the nutritional information is genuinely complex," she said. "A good first challenge." He looked at May, who had discovered something in the sand and was examining it with intense focus. "She asked me last night," he said, "if you could keep her picture of her mom on the nightstand while I'm gone. She said she doesn't want to forget to look at it." Nora was very still beside him. "Of course I will," she said quietly. "She trusts you," James said. "Completely. She doesn't give that easily. It took her 3 months before she'd let Derek carry her, and she's known Derek her whole life." "I know," Nora said. "I don't take it lightly. I know you don't." He looked at her. "That's why I'm telling you." May ran back toward them with a piece of broken shell, which she presented to Nora with great ceremony, and the declaration that it was a gift from the ocean for the person watching the shore. Nora accepted it with complete seriousness, examined it, and said it would go in a specific place on her desk at work where she kept important things. May looked satisfied and ran back to the water. James watched the whole exchange and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the moment hadn't already said better. The night before departure, after May was asleep, James stood in the kitchen for a long time. Not pacing, just standing the way sailors stand when they're finding their footing before a long stretch at sea, grounded, deliberate, feeling the weight of what they're about to carry. Nora came up behind him and put a hand between his shoulder blades. Not a hug, just presence, contact. The specific language of someone who knows that sometimes you don't need words, you just need to know another person is in the room. "You ready?" she asked. "No," he said. "Good," she said. "The ones who are fully ready worry me." He turned around. She was right there, close enough that he could see the gold of her earrings catching the kitchen light, the way her expression had that characteristic quality of being completely present without demanding anything from the moment. "Nora," he said. "Yeah." "I need to say something, and I need you to let me say the whole thing before you respond." "Okay." He looked at her. He had been turning these words over for weeks, arranging them, discarding versions that were too guarded or too large or not accurate enough, and what he'd arrived at was something plain and honest and exactly the right size. When Derek set up that dinner, he said, "I was in the parking lot wanting to leave, and I didn't leave, and you sat down and you said, 'I'm your blind date,' like it was the simplest thing in the world and something just let go. Something that had been locked for a long time." He held her gaze. "These last months have been the first time since Claire died that I felt like a whole person instead of just the functional version of one. And I know that sounds like something someone says in a movie, but I've been over it enough times to know it's just true. You didn't fix me. I wasn't broken in a way that needed fixing. But you—" He paused, finding the exact word. "You reminded me that there was still a full life available, that it wasn't all used up." She was watching him with absolutely still attention. "I love you," he said. "I know the timing is what it is. I know I'm leaving tomorrow morning, but I'm not going to leave without saying it because I've been not saying things for 3 years, and I'm done with that." The kitchen was completely quiet. Nora took one breath. "I love you too," she said. "I've known it for a while. I was waiting for you to get there." A small pause. "Not in a, I wasn't being withholding. I just thought it should come from you first." "Why?" "Because you needed to choose it," she said. "Not respond to it. Choosing it is the part that matters." He reached out and put both hands on either side of her face, gentle and deliberate, and kissed her in his kitchen at 11:23 on a Tuesday night, 4 hours before he had to leave for the base, and she kissed him back with a kind of quiet certainty that had no performance in it at all. When they stepped back, she reached up and straightened his collar, a small gesture automatic. The kind of thing a person does when they've decided to take care of someone and don't need to announce it. "Go check on May," she said. "She's asleep." "I know, go check on her anyway." He went. May was exactly as he'd left her on her side, one arm around the stuffed whale she'd named Commander, her face soft with sleep, her mother's picture on the nightstand where it always was. James sat on the edge of the bed for several minutes in the dark, not touching her. Just present, memorizing this specific ordinary moment, the way sailors memorize landmarks before they lose sight of shore. Then he came back to the kitchen, and Nora was still there washing the 2 coffee cups they'd used, and she looked up when he came in and didn't ask him anything. Just looked at him and nodded slightly, like she understood everything the 4 minutes had contained. "She okay?" Nora asked. "She's perfect," he said. The morning of departure, Nora was there at 5:30. She'd driven herself, refused his suggestion that she didn't need to come that early, and arrived with a thermos of coffee and the specific calm of someone who has decided to make a hard morning as normal as possible through sheer force of deliberate presence. May woke up at 5:45 and came out in her pajamas with her hair going 7 different directions, and stood in the kitchen doorway, looking at her father in his uniform, and did not cry, which James knew cost her something. He crouched down in front of her. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she said. "You know the deal, right?" "I know the deal," she said with a seriousness that made her sound 40 years old. "Be good at school. Listen to Nora. Don't feed the class hamster too many carrots because it gives them digestive problems. Send you pictures of my artwork." She paused. "And not be so sad that I forget to be a kid." That last one hadn't been in the list he'd given her. He stared at her. "Where did that last part come from?" May glanced toward Nora very quickly and back. "I thought of it myself," she said in the specific tone she used when she was telling a truth that wasn't the whole truth. James looked over May's head at Nora, who was studying the middle distance with great concentration. He looked back at May. "That's a very smart last part," he said. "I know," May said. He pulled her into his arms, and she went without resistance, her small arms around his neck, and she pressed her face into his collar. And for 10 seconds, she let herself be as sad as she was, before she straightened up and stepped back, and reassembled herself into the version of May who could handle this because she'd decided to. "Okay," she said. "Go help the people, Daddy." He stood up, looked at Nora. She was already looking at him. She walked over and he held her for a long moment. Not dramatically, just completely the way you hold something you're not ready to put down, but know you have to. "Letters," she said quietly against his shoulder. "Letters." He agreed. "The real version, not the briefing version." "I remember the deal." She stepped back. She had both hands on his upper arms for a moment, looking at him with steady eyes. "We'll be here," she said. "Both of us. Right here." He nodded, picked up his bag. At the door, he turned around one more time. May was standing next to Nora in the kitchen doorway, and Nora had one hand resting lightly on May's shoulder, not holding just there, and the two of them stood together in the kitchen light, watching him, and the image went into him the way important things do, deep and permanent, and past the reach of distance. He walked to his car. He did not look back at it again because he knew if he did, he wouldn't be able to make himself go, and the people in coastal villages who hadn't eaten in 4 days needed him to be able to make himself go. But he carried the image the entire way to the base, and in the months that followed through everything the ship brought him, it stayed exactly where he'd put it, deep and permanent and past the reach of distance. The first letter arrived at Nora's clinic 3 weeks after he deployed. Not an email, not a message. An actual letter handwritten on Navy stationery, postmarked from a port he couldn't name specifically, but had hinted at through reference to the heat and the color of the water. She opened it at her desk between sessions, read it twice, then a third time. It started the way he'd started everything with her, without preamble, without ceremony, just honest and direct. "The sea at this latitude is a different color than anything I've seen. I keep thinking you'd have a word for it. I don't. But I wanted to tell you, it exists." She put the letter down on her desk, pressed one hand flat on the page for a moment. Then she reached into her desk drawer and took out a piece of paper, and she began to write back. And she wrote the real version, not the managed version, not the version that performed being fine, because that was the deal, and she kept her deals. In the living room of a house 20 minutes from the harbor, a 6-year-old girl named May was sitting at the kitchen table after school, drawing a picture of a ship on a flat blue sea. And in the corner of the picture, very small but carefully rendered, she'd drawn 2 figures standing on a shore watching. Waiting. Right where they said they'd be. The letters became the architecture of the months. James wrote when he could, which was not always and not reliably, because a humanitarian naval operation in a flood-devastated coastal region runs on need rather than schedule, and the need was enormous and relentless. There were days when the ship's medical team processed over 200 people. There were nights when the supply operations ran until 3 in the morning and started again at 6. There were moments in the middle of all of it, standing on a deck, watching small boats carry clean water toward a shore, where people had been waiting for days, when James felt the specific and clarifying purpose of why he had stayed in that parking lot 13 years ago and chosen this life. He wrote about those moments. He'd promised Nora the real version, and he kept the promise the way he kept all his promises, completely without hedging. There was a woman today, he wrote, in the 4th week, maybe 60, maybe older. It's hard to tell when someone has been through what these people have been through. She was waiting at the distribution point, and when the water came off the boat, she put both hands on the container and just held it. For a long time. Didn't open it. Just held it. One of the younger sailors next to me asked what she was doing, and I said I thought she was making sure it was real before she let herself believe it. He didn't say anything after that. Neither did I. But I've been thinking about it all day. The specific courage of letting yourself believe something good is real. He sealed the letter and thought about Nora reading it at her desk between sessions. He thought about it often, her desk, her clinic, the particular stillness she had when she was reading something she wanted to hold on to. He'd never seen her read a letter specifically, but he could construct the image precisely from all the other moments of her attention he'd collected and kept. Her letters back came in clusters. The mail system was irregular, port-dependent. The bureaucratic reality of military correspondence, and when a cluster arrived, it was like a tide coming in after a long drought. He read them in order by postmark, carefully, the way you eat something you've been craving and don't want to rush. She wrote about May with the specificity of someone who had been paying complete attention, not summaries. Actual moments. May had a situation at school on Tuesday. One letter read, "Another kid told her that her dad was gone because Navy dads don't really care about their families, they just care about the Navy. I found out because her teacher called me. You have me listed as the emergency contact, which I want you to know I take extremely seriously." By the time I picked her up, May had already handled it. The teacher told me May looked at the kid very calmly and said, "My dad is gone because other people needed him. That's not the same as not caring. That's actually the opposite." And then she went back to her worksheet. I sat in my car for 10 minutes before I went in to get her because I needed a moment. A pause in the handwriting, a slight change in pressure on the pen that he'd learned to read as Nora collecting herself. "She's going to be a formidable person, James. She already is." He read that letter 3 times standing on the deck in the early morning before the operation started with the sea-going bronze in the first light, and he had to put it in his pocket after the 3rd reading because he had work to do, and May's brand of quiet, fierce loyalty was not something he could look at directly for too long without losing his operational composure. He wrote back, "Tell her I know. Tell her I said the formidable ones are the ones who know the difference between caring and leaving. She already knows. Tell her that." Then below that in slightly smaller writing, "How are you, Nora? Not May. Not the logistics of the house. Not the update on the base family services event. How are you?" Her response to that specific question came 2 weeks later, and he recognized immediately that she'd taken her time with it, which meant she'd answered it honestly rather than efficiently. "I'm tired," she wrote. "Good tired, mostly. I'm running 2 additional support groups for deployed spouses, and I picked up an extra clinical day at the Family Services Center because there's a backlog, and I couldn't not. May and I have dinner together 3 nights a week, and she started helping me cook, which is ambitious because she has strong opinions about seasoning that don't always align with the recipe. I am fine. I am genuinely fine. But I miss you in the specific way that lives in the ordinary moments when something happens during the day that I want to tell you, and the telling has to wait. That's the hardest part. Not the big things, the small ones that accumulate." Another shift in pen pressure. "Come home in one piece. That's my only real instruction. Jiabang." November arrived, and with it May's 7th birthday. James had known it was coming for months, and had planned for it the way he planned everything under operational constraints, methodically, with contingencies. He'd arranged through the ship's communications officer and a lieutenant who owed him a professional favor to have a video call scheduled for May's birthday morning at 6 a.m. ship time, which translated to 7 in the evening at home. He'd also sent a package 6 weeks earlier. Nora had confirmed its arrival. She'd confirmed it with a single text. The communication windows were narrow, and he'd given her the satellite messaging access specifically for things that required immediate confirmation that said package arrived. May hasn't stopped looking at the closet where I put it. She's being very dignified about the waiting. The video call was 4 minutes and 32 seconds long because the connection was unstable, and they both knew it might drop, so they got to the important things first. May appeared on the screen in her birthday dress red. Her choice she'd told Nora months ago that 7 was a red year. And she looked at him through the pixelated feed with those enormous brown eyes and said immediately, "You look thinner, Daddy." "Happy birthday, Bug," he said. "Are you eating enough?" "I'm eating fine. Happy birthday." "You have that face you get when you haven't been sleeping enough." "May." "What?" "Happy birthday," he said again, and his voice did something on the second syllable that he didn't entirely control. "You're 7. How does 7 feel?" She considered this seriously the way she considered everything. "Like 6, but with more information," she said. He laughed. Actual surprised, completely real. That's exactly right." "Did you get my letter?" she asked. "I sent the one with the drawing of the ship." "I got it. It's on my bunk. I look at it every morning." "The 2 people on the shore are me and Nora," she said. "In case you couldn't tell because the drawing is small." "I could tell," he said. "I knew exactly who they were." May seemed satisfied. Then she leaned closer to the camera, lowering her voice slightly, like she was telling him something that required privacy, despite the fact that Nora was clearly visible off-screen. "Nora made my birthday cake herself," she said. "She practiced it 3 times. I wasn't supposed to know that, but I saw the practice cakes in her freezer when I was getting ice." "Is the cake good?" "It's the best cake I've ever had," May said with total conviction. "Don't tell her I said that, or she'll know I saw the practice cakes." "I won't say a word," James said. The connection flickered. He had maybe 2 minutes. "May," he said. "Look at me." She looked. "I'm coming home," he said. "I don't know the exact date yet, but I'm coming home. And when I do, we're going to do the birthday properly, the whole thing, whatever you want." "Whatever I want," she said carefully, like she was checking the terms of a contract. "Within reason," he amended. "What's within reason? No trampolines on the roof." "That was one idea, and I let it go," she said with dignity. The connection flickered again harder. "I love you," he said quickly. "I love you too, Daddy," she said. "Eat more." The screen went dark. He sat with the silent tablet for a long moment. Then Nora's text came through the satellite window 4 minutes later. She held it together until the call ended. Then she cried for about 3 minutes, and then she ate 2 slices of cake and declared herself recovered. "She's remarkable," he typed back. "So are you. Thank you for the cake." 3 minutes passed. "Then I told you. 3 tries." The frosting was a journey. He put the tablet down and looked at the sea. Somewhere across all that water in a house 20 minutes from the harbor, his daughter was eating birthday cake that the woman he loved had practiced 3 times to get exactly right. And he let himself feel that all of it. The ache of not being there and the fullness of knowing what was waiting held in the same moment, the way things you love always exist, alongside the cost of loving them. Shush. The hardest night came in early December. It wasn't dramatic. The worst ones rarely are. The ship had been running continuous operations for 11 days, without a full rest cycle, responding to a secondary flooding event that had hit communities they'd already serviced once, which meant people who had just begun to rebuild were starting over again. And the looks on their faces had a particular quality that was different from the first round, a specific kind of exhaustion that lived past fear and into something more resigned. And James had been absorbing those looks for 11 days, without adequate sleep, and without a real communication window, and with the low grinding weight of extended operational command pressing on him in the way it always did when there was no break in sight. He sat in his bunk at 1 in the morning with his back against the wall, and Nora's most recent letter open in his hands, not reading it. He'd already read it 4 times, just holding it, the physical object of it, because there was something about the actual paper that the words were on, something about knowing her hand had touched this specific page that was grounding in a way he couldn't have articulated. He was thinking about something she'd said in the letter. Not the big things, the small ones that accumulate, and he was thinking about all the small things he was missing. May's new tooth that had come in slightly crooked, and that the dentist said would straighten. The Wednesday night dinners that had apparently become a ritual. May cooking, Nora supervising the kitchen, apparently in a state of controlled chaos that May described in her letters with great pride. The walk they'd taken along the harbor on a Sunday, when the weather had briefly turned warm enough, and May had found a piece of sea glass and declared it a message from the ocean that things are going to be okay. He was thinking about how a 7-year-old understood something about the relationship between patience and faith that it had taken him 38 years to begin to understand. He was also thinking in the honest interior, where he let himself think the things he didn't say in operational contexts about how scared he was. Not of the mission, of returning to a life that had become in his absence something he hadn't built. Something that had grown in the space he'd left, tended by someone else's care, and whether he would know how to re-enter it without disrupting the very thing that made it good. He picked up his pen, opened the small notebook he kept for letters. "Nora," he wrote, "it's 1 in the morning, and I'm too tired to be careful, so I'm going to say the thing I haven't said. I'm scared of coming home. Not of you. Not of May. I'm scared of walking back into a life that has learned to function without me, and not knowing how to fit back into the space without breaking something. I watched a sailor on this ship come back from a shorter deployment last year, and he spent 3 months feeling like a guest in his own house, because everything had reorganized around his absence, and nobody knew how to reorganize back. I don't want to be a guest in my own house. I don't want May to have to restructure herself around me again when she's found a rhythm. I don't want to. He stopped, crossed out the last incomplete sentence. Tried again. I don't want to need more from you than is fair to ask. That's the thing. That's what I haven't said. I'm afraid that what I need when I come back is going to be more than I have any right to ask of you. He stopped writing. Read it back. Sealed it and addressed it before he could second-guess it, because the deal was the real version, not the managed version, and he kept his deals. Her response came 18 days later, which was a fast turnaround by current mail standards, which meant she'd written back immediately and sent it priority through the base family services courier channel that she'd apparently figured out how to access. He recognized the envelope by her handwriting and opened it on deck in the gray December morning, standing alone at the rail. James, it said, I need you to listen to me very carefully, and I need you to read this more than once if the first read doesn't fully land. You are not a guest in your own house. You are the reason the house exists the way it does. Everything May and I have built in these months, every Wednesday dinner and Sunday walk and homework session and Saturday aquarium trip, we built it because of you. Because you loved May so completely that she is a person worth knowing. Because you chose deliberately to let someone in after 3 years of not letting anyone in, and that choice changed both our lives. You are not an interruption to what we've built. You are the foundation of it. As for needing too much, James, I'm a trauma therapist who works with returning sailors for a living. I know what reintegration looks like. I know what it costs. And I need you to hear me say this with every bit of professional and personal authority I have. Asking for what you need is not a burden. It is the only way this works. The sailors who struggle coming home are not the ones who ask for too much. They're the ones who ask for nothing and try to reassemble themselves alone in the dark, because they think needing help means they failed somewhere. You have not failed. You are doing something enormous, and you are allowed to come home tired and disoriented and needing more than you can currently name, and I will be there. Not because I think I should be, because I want to be. Now stop scaring me with that letter. Come home. He folded the letter and put it inside the front cover of the notebook, where he kept all of them, which had begun over the course of 4 months to constitute something like the record of a relationship built in the space between presence and absence, in the specific currency of honest words sent across open water. He stood at the rail for a long time. Then he went back to work. The return date came in mid-January, earlier than the 6-month extension had suggested, because the humanitarian phase of the operation had reached a transition point where local infrastructure had recovered enough to hand off primary management to civilian aid organizations. The ship was rotating home. James got the confirmed date on a Tuesday and had a satellite window open to Nora within the hour. Her text came back in 40 seconds. Tell me. He typed the date. 30 seconds of nothing. Then May is going to lose her mind. Then I'm going to lose my mind. Then, don't tell May yet. I want to see her face when you tell her in person. He typed, How am I supposed to tell her in person if I'm on a ship? She typed back, Video call. I'll set it up. I want to watch her face. He laughed at his phone in a satellite communication bay and didn't care who heard it. The video call to tell May happened that evening. Nora set up the tablet on the kitchen table and May came in from the living room, not knowing what the call was for, and James watched her appear on the screen in her after-school clothes, with marker on her left hand, and a smear of something that might have been peanut butter on her chin, and he said, Hey, Bug. And May said, Daddy, why are you smiling like that? Like what? He said. Like you know something, she said with great suspicion. I do know something, he said. What? I'm coming home, he said. In 3 weeks. I have a date. May stared at the screen. Nora, visible at the edge of the frame, was watching May's face with the specific attention of someone who had set this moment up because she understood the value of witnessing it. May's face did approximately 7 things in rapid succession. Then she looked directly at the camera and said very quietly and with complete composure, Promise. Promise. James said. 1 more second of stillness. Then May put her face in her hands and cried. Not sad crying, the other kind. The kind that comes from something that has been held very carefully for a long time, finally being allowed to put down its weight. It lasted about 45 seconds. Then she looked up, wiped her eyes with the marker-stained hand, and said, "Okay, good. I have things to plan." "What kind of things?" James asked. "I need to think about it," she said, with the focused energy of a general revising strategy. "Nora, we need to make a list." "We'll make the list," Nora said. Her voice had something in it that James recognized as the very specific sound of someone who was holding their composure by a thin and deliberate thread. "I love you, Daddy," May said to the screen. "We're going to hang up now because I need to start planning." "I love you too, Bug." "Okay." She looked at Nora. "Nora, where's the notebook?" The screen went dark. James sat in the satellite bay with a connection that had just been terminated by a 7-year-old who had planning to do, and he felt simultaneously, and without contradiction, the pull of the sea he was still on, and the pull of the shore where they were already writing lists. He chose the shore. He always had. The night before the ship docked, James sat at the small desk in his quarters and wrote one more letter. Not to mail, there was no time. He wrote it for himself, or maybe for the version of himself who had sat in a restaurant parking lot 14 months ago wanting to leave, and who had needed at some future point to understand why he'd stayed. "I thought I was done," he wrote. Not dramatically. Not in the way that requires intervention. Just quietly done with the part of life that includes other people in the close way. "I thought I'd had that part and lost it, and I was going to spend the rest of my years being a good father and a good officer, and that was going to be enough. I was wrong. Not about being a good father or a good officer. About enough. Enough turns out to be larger than I thought it was. It turns out to include a woman who names the situation before she sits down and listens like she's going to remember, and practices a birthday cake 3 times for a child she didn't have to love but chose to. It turns out to include the specific weight of a 7-year-old's hand trusting yours, and a letter that arrives on a hard night and says exactly the true thing. It turns out that coming home means more than I thought it meant. Tomorrow I dock. In 3 days, I'll be in my own kitchen. In 4 days, May will have had whatever she's been planning. I don't know what comes next after that. But I know who I'm figuring it out with, and that turns out to be the only navigational information I actually needed." He put the pen down, folded the paper, put it in the notebook with the rest of the letters. Then he went to sleep for the first time in months without the low hum of incompletion in his chest. Nora's last letter, the one that crossed paths with the ship's return, and arrived at the base family services office the same week James docked, sat on his desk for 2 days before anyone thought to bring it to his quarters. When he finally opened it, he was already home, already 3 days back, already deep in the beautiful disorientation of reintegration, May showing him every piece of artwork she'd done in 4 months. Nora sitting at his kitchen table with coffee, watching the tour with a quiet smile. And he read it the way you read something that arrived slightly after it was needed, but was exactly right anyway. "James," it said, "by the time you read this, you'll be closer to home than this letter is. So consider it a postscript to everything that came before. I spent 4 months watching your daughter be brave. I watched her be scared and not admit it to anyone except me, and I watched her work through it, and I watched her become over the course of all those ordinary days someone who knows the difference between waiting and giving up. She never gave up. Not once. She just waited with her whole self. I think she learned that from you. And I think I've learned it too these last months. What it means to wait for something that matters with your whole self instead of a portion of it. You didn't ask me to learn that, but you and May between you taught me anyway. Come home, James. We'll figure out the rest from the kitchen table." He folded it and put it with the others. Then he walked back into the living room, where May was explaining with great thoroughness the organizational system she'd implemented for her artwork collection while he was gone, and Nora was nodding with genuine interest, and the kitchen table was right there visible through the doorway, exactly where it had always been, exactly where it would always be. He stood in the doorway and looked at his 2 people in his house in the ordinary afternoon light. He was home, not just returned. Home in the complete sense, the sense where the place holds not just your address, but the actual weight of your life. He walked into the room and sat down and listened to May explain the artwork system, and Nora caught his eye over May's head and held his gaze for a moment, with an expression that said everything the letters had said, and then a few things more besides. He held her gaze back and said nothing, because some things the kitchen table already knew. He'd been home for 11 days before the disorientation began to lift, not disappear. Disorientation after extended deployment doesn't disappear. It just gradually loses its grip, the way a hand cramps from holding something too long and then slowly finger by finger releases. James knew the process. He'd been through it before. But knowing the process didn't make the experience of it less strange. The particular unreality of standing in your own kitchen, making coffee at 6 in the morning, and needing for a brief and disquieting moment to consciously remind yourself that this was real, that the floor beneath your feet was yours, that the sound of a small girl moving around in the bedroom down the hall was not something you were imagining. May helped. May was extraordinary at the specific work of making things real. She had constructed for his return what she described as the full welcome plan, which she had refined over the 3 weeks between the announcement and the actual docking date. The plan included a handmade banner that used every color of marker she owned, a specific playlist of songs she'd decided he needed to hear in order to get back to normal faster. A formal tour of every change in the house while he was gone. She narrated each one with the energy of a docent at a museum she'd personally curated, and a dinner that she and Nora had cooked together the night before he arrived, so it was ready the moment he walked in. He'd stood at the front door on the day he came home with his bag over his shoulder and this banner above his head, and his daughter in his arms, and his face buried in her hair, and he'd let himself feel all of it. The return, the relief, the complicated fullness of arriving back into a life that had continued without him, and was all the more alive for it. Nora had stood to the side during that first moment. She understood instinctively, the way she always understood the choreography of what people needed, that the first thing had to be James and May complete. Uninterrupted, the reunion of a father and daughter who had crossed 4 months of ocean to get back to each other. She'd waited leaning against the doorframe with her arms folded and an expression on her face that she probably didn't know he could see, which was the expression of someone watching something they'd helped hold together finally becoming whole again. After May had released him, which took a while because she was thorough, James had looked at Nora across the doorway. She'd said simply, "Welcome home, Commander." And he'd walked over and held her with the specific quality of someone who had kept a promise across 4 months of open water, and she'd held him back the same way, and neither of them said anything else for a long moment, because the letters had said everything already. The reintegration, as Nora had both warned and prepared him for, was not without friction. The first week was the one built on adrenaline and relief. The banner, the dinner, the tour, May's artwork system, the catching up. The second week was where the real work lived. James woke up on the 8th morning home and felt without warning the particular flatness that follows, extended operational intensity, the absence of the structure that had been holding him up for 4 months, suddenly making itself known in the form of a Tuesday with no mission parameters, and no watch schedule, and no logistical requirements beyond getting May to school and being a person in a house. He sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and stared at nothing for a long time. Nora came in at 8 after dropping May at school. She'd taken on the morning school run for the first 2 weeks back to give James time to adjust another thing she'd organized without making a production of it, and she took one look at him and sat down across the table. "There it is," she said. "There what is," he said. "The drop," she said. "The week 2 drop. I've seen it 100 times. Doesn't make it less real when it's yours." He looked at her. "I don't know what to do with a Tuesday," he said. And he said it honestly because they were past the point of managing how honest he was with her. "I know," she said. 4 months of constant operational purpose, and now he paused. "I'm sitting here." "You're sitting here," she agreed. "And that's actually the point. The sitting here is the work right now. Your nervous system needs to learn that stillness is safe, that nothing demanding your immediate response doesn't mean something's wrong." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. This is the hardest week. You're going to feel purposeless and slightly unreal, and you're going to want to create urgency where there isn't any, because urgency is what you know. Don't. Just sit with me for a minute. He looked at her hand on his, then at her. How long does this last? He asked. Depends on the person, she said. For you, honestly, probably not long. You have May coming home at 3 o'clock, and that's a very reliable anchor. And you have a follow-up meeting with Base Command next week about the next assignment cycle, so you'll have structural purpose back soon enough. She paused. But for right now today, the work is just this. Coffee. Tuesday. Sitting still without convincing yourself it's a problem. He exhaled. I've missed you, he said, not as a romantic declaration, but as a statement of fact, the way he said true things plainly, with the weight they deserved. I know, she said. I've missed you too. She didn't move her hand. We have time now. We don't have to catch up all at once. He nodded slowly, drank his coffee. Let Tuesday be what it was. By the end of the second week, something had begun to settle. May's delayed birthday celebration happened on a Saturday in late January that she had selected with the authority of someone who had been planning it since November. The plan had evolved considerably from its original conception. The roof trampoline idea had been permanently retired, and what it had become was something quieter and more specific, which James thought was a sign of his daughter growing in the particular direction of knowing what she actually wanted rather than what sounded large. She wanted the three of them, just the three of them, to go back to the harbor. Not the restaurant, not the aquarium, just the harbor path where they'd walked that first Saturday morning. James and Nora with the coffee Nora had brought because she'd expected to beat him there and had planned for it. May knew the story. He'd told her about it sometime in the months before the deployment, casually without ceremony, and she'd filed it in the place where she kept important information. That's where it started, May said, explaining her reasoning with complete matter-of-factness over breakfast the week before. So that's where we should go. For the birthday. Because my birthday is about being a family, and that's where the family started. James looked at his coffee cup. Nora looked at May. That is an excellent reason, Nora said after a moment. I know, May said, and went back to her cereal. They went on Saturday. The harbor in late January was cold in the bone-deep way of the Northeast in winter, and their breath made small clouds, and May walked between them with her hands in both their hands, and her face tipped slightly upward, the way she did when she was experiencing something she wanted to remember, which James recognized, because it was exactly the way he looked when he was doing the same thing. They walked the whole length of the harbor path and back. May pointed out things she'd noticed before, a mooring she thought looked like a face, a particular bench she'd decided was the best thinking spot, a place where the water slapped against the dock pilings in a rhythm she found satisfying. She narrated the walk with the authority of a person returning a visiting dignitary to a place of significance and wanting to make sure they understood the value of it. Halfway back, she stopped and looked up at James with a focused expression. Daddy, she said, I have a question. Okay, he said. It's an important question, she said, establishing parameters. I understand. She looked at him, then at Nora, then back at him. Are you going to marry Nora? She asked with the direct, uncomplicated clarity of a 7-year-old who has identified a logical conclusion and wants confirmation. The harbor path was very quiet. Nora made no sound whatsoever. James looked at his daughter, who was watching him with patient, serious brown eyes waiting for data. He looked at Nora, who was looking at the water with an expression of careful neutrality that was barely containing something else entirely. That, he said slowly, is a significant question. I know, May said. That's why I said it was important. It's something that... He paused. It's something that I think about, he said carefully. And it's something that Nora and I would talk about together, the two of us, before anything. But you think about it, May said, zeroing in on the operative phrase. I think about it, he confirmed. May processed this. Then she looked at Nora. Do you think about it? Nora turned from the water and looked at May with an expression that had stopped trying to be neutral. Yes, she said simply. I think about it. May looked between them with the expression of someone reviewing a completed calculation. Okay, she said. Good. And then she started walking again, pulling both their hands, apparently satisfied that the data-gathering portion of the conversation was complete. James caught Nora's eye over May's head. Nora's expression said several things simultaneously, none of which required words. He held her gaze for a long beat, and something passed between them on that harbor path in the January cold. Not a decision, because the decision he understood now had been accumulating since the night in the restaurant parking lot, when he'd looked at her number in his phone and chosen to let something begin. Not a decision, but a confirmation. The quiet, certain recognition of a thing that had been true for a while now, formally arriving at its own name. He held May's hand and Nora's hand and kept walking. He asked her 3 weeks later, not with a plan, not with a reservation or a ring box sitting in a jacket pocket through an elaborate dinner. He'd thought about doing it that way. He'd actually started the process, had gone so far as to spend 45 minutes in a jewelry store with a jeweler who was very patient about the fact that James apparently had opinions about settings that he couldn't articulate precisely but could identify by process of elimination. And then he'd driven home and walked into his kitchen, and Nora was sitting at the table, correcting session notes with her reading glasses on and her hair loose, and there was a cup of tea going cold beside her laptop because she'd made it and forgotten to drink it, which she always did. And May was at the table doing homework, with the specific focused breathing she used when she was concentrating, and the kitchen smelled like the dinner they'd had 2 hours ago, and the ordinary weight of the scene hit him with such specific, precise force that he understood immediately that this was the moment, not because it was arranged, but because it was real. He put his keys on the counter. Nora looked up, registered something in his face. Hey, she said. Hey, he said. May, can you do me a favor? May looked up from her homework, assessed his expression with the same data-gathering attention she always brought to significant moments. Is this the important question? She asked immediately. He stared at her. How did you have the face, May said simply. The important question face. It's different from the normal thinking face. Nora had taken her reading glasses off and was very still at the table. I haven't said anything yet, James said. You don't have to, May said. I can tell. She closed her homework book with great deliberateness. Do you want me to give you privacy or stay? He looked at Nora. Nora looked back at him with an expression that said the decision was entirely his. Stay, he said, if you want to. May folded her hands on the table. I'm staying, she said with immense dignity. He crossed the kitchen. He didn't have the ring. The ring was not yet the ring. It was still a set of specifications in a jewelry store somewhere, but he stood in front of Nora at his kitchen table, and he looked at her and he said the thing. The way he said all true things plainly, and with the weight it deserved. I've been thinking about what May asked on the harbor, he said. And I've been thinking about the parking lot 14 months ago, and the restaurant, and every letter, and every phone call, and every ordinary Tuesday, and every hard week since then. He held her gaze. I don't have a ring yet. I was going to do this differently. But I'm standing in my kitchen looking at you in my kitchen, and I know that the formal version of this was never going to be as true as this version, so. He paused. Nora Whitfield. Will you marry me? He said it as a statement and a question simultaneously, the way certain things are both. Nora looked at him for a long moment. Her reading glasses were in one hand and her pen was in the other, and she was sitting at his kitchen table in the light of an ordinary February evening. And she looked, he thought, exactly like what she was. A woman who had walked into a blind date 14 months ago and named the situation before she sat down, and then quietly and without fanfare become the foundation of everything that followed. Yes, she said. The way she said everything important without hesitation, without performance, with the full weight of choosing it. Yes, absolutely yes. May made a sound beside them that was somewhere between a cheer and a confirmation of data, the sound of a 7-year-old who has been tracking the probability of this outcome and is satisfied to see the calculation resolve correctly. James reached across the table and took Nora's face in his hands, the same way he had in the kitchen before deployment, gentle and deliberate, and kissed her, and she kissed him back, and May said, "Okay, that part I didn't need to watch," and went back to her homework. He laughed against Nora's mouth. She pulled back and was laughing too, and her eyes were bright, and she reached up and straightened his collar. That same automatic gesture, the one she'd done the morning he deployed, and said, "You still need to get the ring." "I know," he said. "I have specifications." "Of course you do," she said. "They're detailed." "I wouldn't expect anything less." May from behind her homework. "Can I help pick it?" "No," James said. "I have good taste," May said. "Your taste runs toward things that are mournful but dignified." James said, "I'm not putting that on a ring." "That's a very sophisticated aesthetic," May said with great offense. Nora was laughing again fully and without restraint, the head tilted back kind that he'd first heard across a restaurant, and filed somewhere important, and the sound of it in his kitchen on a Tuesday night in February was one of those small and enormous things that accumulate into a life. They were married in May. Not a large wedding, neither of them wanted large. What they wanted was real, and real, they had both learned, tends toward the specific and the intimate rather than the broad and the performed. The ceremony was at the harbor. Nora's choice, which had been May's indirect suggestion, the harbor is where the family started, filtered through Nora's genuine agreement that there was no more honest location available to them. The officiant was a retired Navy chaplain who had performed ceremonies for dozens of James's fellow sailors, and who delivered the short direct service James had requested with the economy of a man who understood that the words themselves were not the marriage. The marriage was the two people standing in front of each other choosing. Derek stood beside James. Pam cried from the second row, which she had announced in advance she was going to do, and she had not been wrong about that. Several sailors from James's current assignment attended in dress uniform because sailors show up for their commanders in the ways that matter. Nora's two colleagues from the clinic were there, the women who had assessed James carefully when they first met him, and who had apparently decided over the intervening months that he had passed their version of May's test. May carried the rings. She carried them in a small wooden box that she had selected herself after a rigorous evaluation process, and she carried them with the solemn, focused precision of someone who understood the weight of what she was holding. She wore a dress that was red, obviously red because 7 was a red year, and she saw no reason to deviate from the established color system for an occasion of this magnitude, and her hair was done up in a way that she'd described as serious but not stiff, which the hairdresser had somehow translated accurately. When the moment came, and she stepped forward and opened the box, she looked first at James, then at Nora, and then back at James with a small private expression that said everything she'd processed over 14 months. The dinner she hadn't known about, the aquarium visit, the harbor walk, the deployment, the letters, the birthday cake, practice 3 times the kitchen table, the important question, face all of it, and she said quietly just to him, "She passed every test, Daddy." He had to take a breath before he could take the ring. Nora heard it. He saw her hear it. He watched something move through her expression, deep and permanent, and past the reach of anything that could undo it. The chaplain completed the ceremony. James put the ring on Nora's hand, and she put the ring on his, and the chaplain said the words that made it official, and the handful of people gathered at the harbor made the sound that people make when something right and true becomes formal. James looked at Nora, his wife, a word he was going to have to practice saying because he'd been careful with it for 3 years, and now it was available again and meant something completely new. And she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said across 14 months of ordinary mornings and hard nights and honest letters and a kitchen table that had become the center of everything. He kissed her. She kissed him back. May said, "Okay," in a satisfied tone, and several people laughed, and Derek made a sound that was suppressed emotion badly managed, and Pam was crying openly, and had been for several minutes. The harbor was wide and cold and silver in the May light, and the water moved. The way water always moves, without agenda, without ceremony, simply present and continuous. And above them, the sky was the particular shade that James had spent months trying to describe in letters. and couldn't the one Nora said she'd have a word for. She found it that day standing at the harbor with his ring on her hand. Limitless, she said, looking up at it. That's the word. The color is limitless. He looked up, then at her. That's the word, he said. The reception was at Derek and Pam's house, their backyard, which Pam had transformed with lights and flowers and a determination that the evening would be exactly right. There was food and music and the specific warmth of a gathering of people who were there because they actually belonged there, not because a guest list required them. Somewhere around 9 in the evening, James found May sitting on the back steps, alone. Her shoes off her red dress, slightly grass-stained at the hem from a game she'd been playing with 2 other kids earlier. She had a piece of wedding cake on a plate balanced on her knee, and she was eating it with great concentration. He sat down beside her. "How are you doing?" he asked. "Good," she said. "This is the best cake I've ever had." "Better than your birthday cake." May considered this seriously. "Different," she said diplomatically. "Nora's birthday cake was more personal. This one is more official." He put his arm around her. She leaned into him with the easy, complete trust of a child who has never once doubted that her father would be there when she leaned. "May," he said. "Yeah, you did something important," he said. "Over this past year. You were brave in ways I didn't ask you to be, and didn't know you were being, and I want you to know I see it." She was quiet for a moment. "I was scared sometimes," she said. "When you were on the ship. I didn't always show it." "I know," he said. "Nora told me. In her letters." "I told her not to tell you. She told me you told her not to tell me," he said. "And then she told me anyway because she said I needed to know." He paused. She was right. May considered this with a small nod that conceded the point. "She's usually right," she said. "Yeah," James said. "She is." May ate a bite of cake, looked at the backyard where the lights were strung, and people were still talking, and Nora was laughing at something Pam had said, her head tilted back, completely present. "Daddy?" May said. When I said she passed the test, at the ceremony." She looked at her plate. "I didn't mean it like a test where she could fail. I meant it like..." She paused, organizing. "Like when you already know the answer but you check anyway, because it matters enough to make sure." He looked at the side of her face. His daughter, 7 years old. Claire's eyes and cheekbones and some quality of understanding that seemed to belong entirely to herself. "I know exactly what you meant," he said. "Okay," she said. "Good." They sat on the steps together for a while longer, and the party continued around them, and at some point Nora came and sat on James's other side with her own piece of cake, and May immediately assessed it and said, "Yours has a better frosting to cake ratio." And Nora said, "You can have half." And May accepted this without further comment, and the 3 of them sat on Derek's back steps, eating wedding cake in the May evening, and nobody said anything for a long time, because nothing needed to be said. This was the thing. This ordinary, specific, completely sufficient thing. A year after the wedding, James and Nora and May went back to the harbor side. Nora's idea, though, she'd floated it casually enough that James suspected she'd been thinking about it for a while. "We should go back," she said one morning over coffee, "to where it started. I think May should see it." May, who had of course heard the restaurant story multiple times by now, had immediate opinions about the appropriate order of menu items and whether they should sit at the same table. And James said he didn't know which table it had been exactly. And May said she bet the hostess would remember because it was an important night, and important nights leave an impression. Which was the kind of thing she said now that made Nora look at James with an expression of pure, helpless admiration. They got the window table. James didn't know if it was the same one. It didn't matter. May studied the menu with focused intensity, and then looked up and said, "Okay, I know what I want." And then, with the deliberate gravity of someone completing a ritual, "I'm going to have the salmon." She looked at Nora. "Because that's what you ordered." Nora lowered her menu slowly. "You remembered that," James said. "I remember everything about the important stories," May said simply. Nora reached across the table and squeezed May's hand once, quick and sure, and May squeezed back without looking up from the menu, and James watched his two people at the table in the restaurant where everything had started, and felt the full accumulated weight of every choice that had led here. The parking lot the hour he'd stayed past 8:30. The coffee at 7:14 in the morning, the harbor walk the park, the deployment orders the letters, the kitchen table, the ring he'd bought with detailed specifications, the harbor ceremony, the back steps, and the wedding cake. All of it arriving here at this table, at this ordinary, extraordinary evening with the harbor outside the window, and the three of them ordering dinner because they were a family, and families have dinner together. After dessert, James reached into his jacket pocket. He put something on the table beside Nora's plate. Not a ring, the ring was already where it belonged. What he set down was a folded piece of paper. She looked at it, looked at him. "Read it," he said. She unfolded it. He watched her read. He'd written it that morning, standing at the kitchen counter, while the coffee brewed, trying to say accurately the thing that 14 months of letters had been building toward, and that he hadn't yet said in exactly the right words. It read, "I came here 14 months ago, not wanting to be here. I sat in the parking lot and thought about leaving. I thought I was done, not dramatically, just quietly, in the way a man decides that a certain portion of life has passed, and what remains is enough, and he should be grateful for what he had and stop expecting more. I was wrong. You sat down across from me and named the situation, and something let go in my chest that I didn't know was still locked. And everything that came after May's hand reaching for yours. The letters across 4 months of open water. The kitchen table. The harbor in January. The important question. All of it has been the answer to something I'd stopped believing was still being asked. I thought I came here for dinner. I didn't know I was meeting the woman who would help my daughter smile again and remind me that coming home means more than returning from sea. It means arriving somewhere you're known. Arriving somewhere you're held. Arriving somewhere that knows your weight and holds it willingly. That's what you gave me. That's what you are to me. Thank you for sitting down." Nora read it twice. He watched her read it twice. When she looked up, her eyes were bright in the restaurant light, and she smiled the same smile she'd had the night they met. The one that reached the corners of her eyes before it reached her mouth. The one he'd filed somewhere important the first time he saw it, and had been filing every version of it since. "I'm glad I sat down," she said. "So am I," he said. May, who had been eating her dessert with focused discretion and then looked up at exactly the right moment, studied both their faces and arrived at her assessment. "Good," she said. "That's settled then." She went back to her dessert. James looked at Nora across the table. Nora looked back at him. Outside, the harbor moved the way it always had, wide and silver and continuous, carrying everything that came to it and releasing everything it needed to release, and keeping what needed to be kept, the way water does, the way time does, the way love does, when it's the real kind. The real kind doesn't begin with fireworks or destiny. It doesn't announce itself or perform its arrival. It sits down across from you on an ordinary evening and names the situation and holds your daughter's hand on a path and writes you letters across 4 months of open water and practices a birthday cake 3 times and stands with you in the kitchen at 11:23 at night and says, "I love you too. I've known it for a while. I was waiting for you to get there." It waits for you to get there. And then when you finally do, when you find yourself sitting at a harbor table with the woman who changed everything and the daughter who understood it before you did, with 14 months of choosing each other, already behind you, and everything else still ahead, you realize that the greatest love story you will ever live didn't begin the night you thought it did. It began the moment you stopped talking yourself out of it and walked through the door.